The morning sun peeked through the tall glass windows of Atlanta International Airport. Inside, the place was busy and loud. Rolling suitcases clicked across the floor, announcements echoed over the speakers, and passengers moved quickly, trying not to miss their flights. In the middle of all this noise and motion, the Taylor family walked calmly through the terminal toward Gate 32 Bits. Marvin Taylor, a tall man in his early 50s, led the way. He walked with quiet confidence, dressed in a clean dark sweater, simple slacks, and polished shoes. Beside him was his wife, Monica, wearing a soft blue cardigan and jeans. Their daughter, Zoe, who was about 13, followed close behind with her backpack and a small travel pillow in her arms. They weren't loud or flashy, but people still noticed them. Something about the family made them stand out. Maybe it was how calm they were. Maybe it was how they carried themselves, like they belonged, wherever they went. Marvin had just finished a big week in New York, attending a board meeting that would shape the future of his company. Now, they were flying back home to Dallas for a quiet weekend. Zoe had a school project due on Monday. Monica was looking forward to catching up on reading. Marvin just wanted to sleep. As they reached their gate, the boarding process had already begun. The Taylor family had first-class tickets, so they joined the short line of passengers waiting to step onto the plane. The woman scanning tickets smiled at the man in front of them, then scanned the Taylor family's passes one by one. There was no problem. But the moment they stepped onto the plane, something shifted. A flight attendant named Lindsay stood at the door. She had short blonde hair, a neat uniform, and a name tag pinned carefully on her jacket. When she saw the Taylors, her smile faded just a little. It wasn't obvious, just enough to feel different. "Excuse me," she said, holding out her hand. "Can you step aside for a moment?" Marvin blinked. "Is there a problem?" "I just need to check something quickly," Lindsay said, her tone cool and firm. "Your seating may need to be verified." Passengers behind them began to shift, some looking confused, others just waiting to get to their seats. Monica quietly asked Zoe to step aside so others could pass. Marvin stayed calm. "We're in 2A, 2 Bits, and 2C. Is there an issue?" Lindsay glanced at their boarding passes, then at them again. "Just routine," she said. They waited patiently while others boarded. A few people looked over with curious eyes. One man gave them a quick nod, as if to say, "Hang in there." The family stayed quiet. When Lindsay finally let them continue, there was no apology. She simply said, "You can go ahead now." Marvin led his family down the aisle toward the front of the plane, his face unreadable. He didn't say a word, but something in the air had changed. And though the plane hadn't left the ground yet, the flight was already heading in a strange direction. Marvin, Monica, and Zoe reached their seats near the front of the plane. The first-class cabin was quiet, with only a few passengers already seated. Soft music played overhead, and the scent of fresh coffee floated through the air. The seats were wide, with plenty of legroom and clean white pillows resting on each one. Marvin helped Zoe place her backpack in the overhead bin, then gently sat down beside her. Monica settled into her window seat, pulling out a small book. Everything seemed calm again, for a moment. Lindsay, the flight attendant, walked past them, giving a second glance at their row. Her eyes stayed on them a little longer than needed. She didn't offer them water or greet them like she had with the other passengers. Instead, she walked right by with a tight expression on her face. A few minutes later, she returned. "I need to see your boarding passes again," she said to Marvin. Marvin looked up, surprised. "Again, is there a problem?" "I just want to make sure these seats are correct," she said, not smiling. Marvin reached into his jacket and handed her the 3 passes. She looked at them carefully, then at the seats, then back at the family. "These are first-class seats," she said slowly, as if it didn't make sense. "Yes," Marvin replied calmly. "We booked them 2 weeks ago." "Well," Lindsay said, pausing, "we've had situations where passengers were placed in the wrong section. It happened sometimes. Monica raised her eyebrows but said nothing. Zoe looked at her father, trying to understand what was happening. Marvin stayed polite. We've flown this airline many times. There's no mistake. Lindsay nodded slowly, still staring at the passes, then handed them back without another word. She walked off again, her steps quick and stiff. A man across the aisle leaned toward Marvin and whispered, "That was strange. She didn't check anyone else's ticket twice." Marvin gave a small nod but didn't respond. He had learned over the years not to react too quickly. Sometimes silence said more than words. Zoe looked up at him. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" He smiled gently at her. "No, sweetie. We're just going to sit here and enjoy the flight, like everyone else." But as more passengers boarded, it became clear that something felt off. Lindsay moved through the cabin, offering drinks and helping people with their bags. She smiled at the older couple in row 1, made a joke with a man in row 3, but never came back to the Taylor family. Other passengers started noticing too. A woman in the back leaned forward, watching the scene unfold. A man near the front glanced back and forth between Lindsay and the Taylors, shaking his head slightly. Marvin took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't angry, just thoughtful. He had seen this kind of treatment before, and he could feel it building again. He hoped things would calm down, but something told him this flight was far from ordinary. A few more minutes passed as passengers finished boarding. The captain made a short announcement, welcoming everyone on board and saying they would be taking off soon. Outside the windows, airport trucks moved along the runway, and the sky was beginning to turn a soft orange as the sun climbed higher. Inside the plane, everything seemed normal, except for the air around the Taylor family. The mood in their row was quiet but tense. Marvin kept his eyes on the small screen in front of him. Monica flipped through her book without really reading, and Zoe stared out the window. Then, without warning, Lindsay returned. "I'm sorry," she said, standing beside their seats, "but I still need to verify that these are your correct seats." Marvin looked up slowly. "We already showed you the passes twice." "I understand," Lindsay replied, "but it's important to make sure people are seated correctly, especially in first class." Marvin stayed calm. "We were checked at the gate. We've flown this airline before. There's no mistake." Lindsay didn't look convinced. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "We've had situations where people moved into seats they didn't pay for. I'm just doing my job." Monica looked up. "Are you saying we moved into these seats without permission?" Lindsay didn't answer that directly. She only said, "We're trying to keep everything in order." Marvin handed her the passes again. She glanced at them, her eyes narrowing slightly, then gave them back. "I'll speak with the cabin supervisor," she said, and walked off again. As she left, a quiet buzz of whispers began around the cabin. A woman 2 rows back leaned toward her neighbor and muttered something. A man in a business suit shook his head in disbelief. "This is starting to feel wrong," Monica said softly. Marvin nodded. "Let's just stay calm." Zoe whispered, "Why does she think we didn't pay for our seats?" Marvin didn't want her to feel upset, so he spoke gently. "Sometimes people make guesses without knowing the full story." Just then, another flight attendant walked past. She gave the Taylors a small, kind smile, then continued down the aisle. It was the first friendly look they had received since boarding. A few moments later, Lindsay returned with a man in a dark uniform. He looked like the cabin supervisor. He had a badge on his jacket and a serious expression. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "I believe they may be sitting in the wrong section," Lindsay said. Marvin stayed seated. "Our tickets are correct. We've shown them several times." The supervisor looked at the passes, then back at Lindsay. "These are valid first-class tickets," he said plainly. Lindsay frowned but said nothing. Marvin looked at the supervisor. "Can we please enjoy our flight now?" The supervisor gave a polite nod. "Of course, sir." As he walked away, Lindsay remained silent for a moment, then turned and followed. The family sat quietly again, but the mood had changed. People were watching now, and though the plane hadn't lifted off yet, something heavy was already hanging in the air. The plane slowly began to taxi toward the runway, and the sounds of the engine started to fill the cabin. Outside, the airport seemed to fade away as the plane moved toward the open sky. But inside, the atmosphere felt anything but peaceful. The tension was still thick, and Marvin couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The family sat in silence for a while, each person lost in their thoughts. Marvin kept his hands folded calmly in his lap, while Monica flipped through her book, trying to focus but clearly distracted. Zoe stared out the window, her thoughts far from the beauty of the clouds outside. Then, just as the plane was about to reach the runway, a sudden voice came over the intercom. It wasn't the usual calm voice of the captain. It was the flight attendant's voice. "Lindsay." "Attention," she said, her tone cold and firm. "I'm going to ask that the Taylor family leave the plane immediately. We're having a situation and need to resolve it." Marvin's head snapped up. He looked at Monica, then at Zoe. Both of them were startled, and a few passengers nearby glanced over, their faces full of confusion. "Excuse me?" Marvin said, standing up slowly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "What do you mean, leave the plane?" Lindsay, now standing at the front of the cabin, didn't answer directly. She simply gestured toward the door and said again, "Please step off the plane. We need to address this." Marvin felt his stomach twist. This was not just a misunderstanding anymore. Something was going wrong, and it was happening now. He stood, his voice calm but unwavering. "There's no reason for us to leave," he said firmly. But before Lindsay could respond, another flight attendant appeared beside her. The new attendant was younger, looking nervous, but she spoke with authority. "Sir," she said, "we're asking you to deboard the plane. There's no room for discussion at this point. Please come with us." The air around the Taylor family grew heavier. A few people turned to watch, their faces drawn with curiosity or concern. Marvin could feel the stares but kept his composure. Zoe, wide-eyed, grabbed her father's sleeve. "Dad, what's happening?" Marvin knelt down to her level. "Sweetie, it's going to be okay. We're just going to talk to someone and get this cleared up." Monica, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "This is ridiculous. We're not going anywhere. We've done nothing wrong." The younger attendant hesitated, glancing at Lindsay for guidance. Lindsay gave a slight nod, and the attendant reluctantly took a step back. Marvin turned to his family. "Let's just stay calm and stay seated," he said in a low voice. "We'll figure this out." But just as the tension seemed to settle for a moment, a new voice echoed from the front of the plane. It was the captain. He had come into the cabin, standing at the front by the door. "There's no reason for this family to be removed," the captain said in a firm voice, looking at both the attendants. "This needs to stop right now." Marvin looked at the captain, and for the first time, he felt a small sense of relief. The captain's calm authority cut through the air like a knife. The attendants stood back, unsure of what to do. The situation had gotten out of hand, and as the passengers waited, many of them now fully aware of what was happening, Marvin felt a growing sense of disbelief. What had started as a small mistake was turning into something much larger and more unsettling. The tension inside the cabin was unbearable. Marvin, Monica, and Zoe sat there, still and quiet, their eyes locked on the captain as he stood in the aisle. The other passengers watched, some leaning forward in their seats to get a better look at what was happening, others pretending to read or look out the window, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. The captain, still calm, turned to the attendants. "I'm sorry, but this needs to end now," he said, his voice firm. "The family is not leaving. They have valid tickets, and this incident is over." Lindsay, the flight attendant who had started it all, stood frozen by the door. Her face was pale, and she looked as though she was still trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong. She didn't speak. The younger attendant, who had looked so unsure earlier, glanced between the captain and Lindsay. She clearly didn't want to be caught in the middle of this, and it showed in her nervous expression. Marvin, sensing that the worst of it might be over, stood up slowly. "We'll leave the plane," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But only if we're given the opportunity to speak to the manager." Monica looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and frustration, but she said nothing. Zoe, too, was quiet, but her grip on her father's hand tightened. She still didn't fully understand what was going on, but she could feel the unease in the air. The captain nodded. "I'll have someone speak to you. Please sit back down for now." Marvin nodded in return and helped Monica back into her seat. Zoe sat quietly beside her mother, still gripping her father's hand. The captain turned away and walked toward the cockpit, but before he disappeared, he gave one last look toward the family. It wasn't much, a slight nod, but it was enough to show he wasn't on the side of the attendants. Minutes passed in silence, each one longer than the last. Marvin glanced out the window at the runway, watching the planes taxi by. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, and it made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it felt like everything was stacked against him. Soon, a new person appeared at the front of the cabin. A woman dressed in a crisp uniform, her name tag reading Susan. She walked quickly down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She stopped in front of the Taylor's seats and looked at them, her expression apologetic but firm. "Mr. Taylor," she said, addressing Marvin directly. Marvin nodded. "We need you and your family to step off the plane," Susan continued. "The situation has escalated, and we need to resolve it before the flight can continue." Marvin didn't hesitate. He stood up, motioning for his family to do the same. "We'll leave," he said, his voice even, "but we're not going without answers." As they made their way down the aisle, the other passengers remained silent. No one spoke up, but their eyes followed the family as they left the plane. Marvin felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. They had been treated unfairly, and now they were being escorted off the plane, without a chance to speak their side of the story. When they stepped out onto the tarmac, a sense of finality settled over the situation. The family stood in the cold air, looking back at the plane that had just moments ago been their home for the next few hours. It was a strange feeling, one Marvin hadn't expected. He had hoped for a smooth flight, a quiet trip home. But instead, he had been forced into a public confrontation. Yet despite everything, Marvin didn't feel defeated. There was still a part of him that knew the truth would come out, one way or another. The tarmac was cold under Marvin's shoes as he stood with Monica and Zoe. The plane, now just a few feet away, loomed in the distance. The engines had powered down, but the noise of the airport around them was still loud. Marvin could see the crew inside the plane, moving about as they prepared for the next steps, but it felt like they were all ignoring the situation that had just unfolded. A few minutes passed before a man in a navy blue suit walked up to them. He had a professional look, his hair neatly combed, and his face serious but not unfriendly. He stopped just a few feet away from the family, glancing at each of them briefly before speaking. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Charles, the customer service manager," he said, his voice steady. "I've been informed of the situation, and I'd like to get this cleared up." Marvin stood up straighter, his calm exterior still intact. "Thank you for coming. I want to understand why we were treated this way. We did nothing wrong." Charles nodded, looking down at a tablet in his hands. "We've had some miscommunication," he said slowly, "and it seems like there was a mistake with your seating arrangements. But I need to apologize for the way this was handled. That shouldn't have happened." Marvin was still frustrated, but he kept his voice controlled. A mistake is one thing, but being removed from the plane, humiliated in front of other passengers, that's not acceptable. Monica crossed her arms, her expression hardening, And how do you explain the way we were treated by the flight attendants? Being told twice to leave when there was no reason. Charles sighed, looking down at the tablet again, as if searching for the right words. Unfortunately, it seems like the flight attendants acted out of turn. They believed there was an issue with your seating, and they didn't handle it well. But that's no excuse. I assure you, this will be addressed. Zoe, who had been quiet up until now, looked up at Charles with wide eyes. Are we going to be able to fly home today? She asked softly. Marvin knelt down beside his daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're not leaving until this is sorted out. Charles nodded, his eyes softening. I understand, and I'll do everything I can to make this right. I can offer you new tickets on a different flight, or we can resolve the issue and get you back on the plane immediately. Monica shook her head. We've already been through enough. I don't want to get back on that plane. We need a proper explanation first. Marvin agreed. We'll wait here, but we won't move until we get the answers we deserve. Charles paused for a moment, taking in their words. All right. I'll go speak with the flight crew and make sure this gets handled properly. I'll be back shortly. As Charles walked away toward the terminal, Marvin looked at Monica, who was still upset but trying to stay strong. Zoe, too, seemed a little calmer now that the situation was in someone else's hands. They stood there in silence, surrounded by the sounds of the airport, each of them lost in their own thoughts. It felt like hours had passed before Charles returned, but in reality, it had only been about 20 minutes. He walked back toward them with a serious look on his face, carrying a small stack of papers. I've spoken to the flight crew and reviewed the situation, Charles began, his voice now more official. It was a misunderstanding about your tickets. They've been confirmed, and I've spoken to the attendants about how to handle situations like this in the future. Marvin nodded, still not fully satisfied but relieved that things were moving forward. And the way we were treated. Charles looked directly at him. That was unacceptable, and I sincerely apologize. The attendants will be retrained, and I assure you this won't happen again. Marvin took a deep breath, finally feeling like he was getting somewhere. Thank you. That's all we wanted to hear. The air felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted. But Marvin knew this wasn't over yet. The experience had left a mark, but he was determined to make sure the airline would remember how they treated his family. The cool breeze from the runway had started to feel refreshing after the long moments of tension. Marvin, Monica, and Zoe stood by the terminal, waiting for Charles to return. The weight of the situation was still on their shoulders, but for the first time since everything had gone wrong, they felt like they might finally get some answers. As Charles approached them again, this time with a more apologetic look, Marvin felt a small sense of relief. Charles carried a new set of boarding passes in his hand, the papers neatly folded, and his expression seemed genuinely concerned. Thank you for your patience, Charles began, addressing the family. I've made arrangements. I'm sorry for the way everything happened. We've taken steps to fix the issue. Marvin nodded, appreciating the apology, but still needing more clarity. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. It wasn't just the mistake with the seats. It was how we were treated after. Charles looked down for a moment, clearly thinking. You're right. No one should ever be treated like that, especially when they've done nothing wrong. I've made sure this situation will be reported to higher management, and I've asked for further training on handling passengers with respect. Monica gave a small nod, her arms still crossed. That's all we can ask for. But it doesn't undo what happened. No, it doesn't, Charles agreed, his voice low. And that's why, in addition to the apology, we're offering you full reimbursement for your flight, as well as compensation for the trouble. Marvin took a moment to consider the offer. While the reimbursement was appreciated, it didn't erase the stress, embarrassment, or time lost during the ordeal. Still, it was a step forward. We'll accept it, Marvin said finally, but it's not just about the money. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Charles nodded again, his tone sincere. "We understand, and I promise we'll be reviewing our policies to prevent incidents like this in the future." Zoe, who had been quietly holding her father's hand, looked up at Charles with a thoughtful expression. "Will the people who treated us badly get in trouble?" she asked, her voice a little uncertain. Charles hesitated for just a moment before answering. "The flight attendants will be given proper guidance and training. This situation will be handled internally, but rest assured, there are consequences for handling passengers in such a way. No one should feel uncomfortable or singled out for any reason." Marvin looked at his daughter, her innocent question reminding him of how deeply the experience had affected her. She had only wanted a smooth flight, a simple journey, but instead she had witnessed something far more complex. "Thank you for listening," Marvin said to Charles. "It means a lot to us that you took the time to understand the situation." Charles smiled, a look of relief crossing his face. "Thank you for giving us the chance to make it right. We'll do better." With that, Charles handed over the new boarding passes. "Your new flight is ready, and we've ensured it's a direct route. I'll make sure you're comfortable on board." Marvin took the passes, feeling the weight of the entire ordeal slowly lift. "We'll get on the next flight," he said, "but I hope this situation is a reminder of the importance of respect for all passengers." As they made their way toward the gate, the family walked together in silence, each of them reflecting on what had happened. It wasn't just about a flight being delayed or a small mistake. It was about how people are treated when things go wrong. They had stood up for themselves, and in the end, their voices had been heard. Marvin looked at Monica and Zoe, offering a quiet smile. "Let's just get home." And with that, the family stepped into the next chapter of their journey, hopeful that the lessons learned would lead to better experiences in the future. As they boarded the new flight, the Taylor family felt a sense of quiet relief wash over them. It wasn't the same excitement they'd had before the ordeal, but at least it felt like the end of the stressful chapter they had just experienced. They walked down the jet bridge, and Marvin noticed that this time, the flight attendants greeted them with warm smiles and friendly words. Zoe, still a little shaken but slowly feeling better, looked up at her parents. "Do you think it'll be okay now?" she asked, her voice soft. Marvin smiled at her and nodded. "Yes, sweetie. I think we're going to be just fine." Monica, who had been quiet for most of the ordeal, seemed to relax as well. It wasn't perfect, but they had been heard, and that made all the difference. The anger and frustration that had built up over the last few hours were beginning to fade, replaced with a sense of hope that the situation was being taken seriously. As they walked to their seats, the captain of the flight, a kind-looking man with a friendly face, stood in the doorway. He greeted them and made a point of addressing them personally, making sure they felt comfortable and welcomed. Marvin could sense that the airline was trying to make amends, and that made him feel a bit more at ease. They took their seats, and Marvin looked out the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The ground crew outside was bustling, but inside the cabin, everything was calm. It was a strange feeling. After all the chaos and tension, there was finally a sense of normality. Zoe leaned her head against the window, watching the airport slip away beneath them. "It's like we're finally going home," she said softly. Monica looked over at Marvin, and for the first time in a while, they shared a small, quiet smile. It was a simple moment, but in that moment, Marvin realized just how much this experience had changed them. They had come together as a family, stood up for what was right, and now they were going home. That was all that mattered. The plane lifted off the ground, and the world outside the window started to change. The view became a blur of clouds and sky, and Marvin felt a small sense of peace settling in his chest. The ordeal was over, and there was no need to dwell on the past. They had made it through, and now they could move forward. As the plane soared higher, Monica leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed for a moment. She let out a deep breath, as if releasing the last bit of tension that had been holding her body tight. Zoe, too, seemed to finally relax, her hands resting comfortably in her lap. Marvin looked at them both, grateful for their strength and patience. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about the journey they had taken together. They had faced adversity, stood up for themselves, and come out the other side stronger. No matter what happened next, they would be okay. And as the plane climbed higher into the sky, Marvin knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the hardest experiences lead to the most meaningful lessons, and this family had learned that together.